everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Alex and today I'm going to be doing a review of The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. I will also be giving a spoiler section at the end of the video, but don't worry, you will have plenty of warning before we get to that, and also my background will change so you'll be able to differentiate the two sections. To give you a little bit of background on this story, this is about 4 American Indian men who had an incident in their youth on their reservation when they were in the Elder Hunting Grounds, a place that they weren't supposed to be, and now 10 years later they are being hunted by an entity that is seeking revenge. I will give a trigger warning for animal violence in this book, both against dogs and elk. There's a fair amount of graphic descriptions, and that also goes for what happens to some of the people in this book too. It's gory, it's descriptive. If that is a kind of content that typically bothers you, I would not recommend picking this up because it also starts very early in the book. I mean, our first incident with a dog happens in the first 40 pages, and I was not expecting that at all. One of my subscribers, Cherry Cheetah, attempted to tell me in my horror tropes video that this book had animal violence in it and that I might not like it, but by then I had already posted my Native American Heritage Month TBR, and in that I had already started reading this and I had already gotten to the first section, so by then it was too late and I was invested in getting through this. All of that said, when I finished this book, I told myself that I would not let my final rating be dictated by my feeling about the violence in this book. Just because it's something that I don't like to see doesn't mean that this is a bad book. So it is going to be judged on the way that it was written and its plot, as it should be. If I had to choose one word to describe this book, it would be effective. And it's effective because the descriptions cause so much discomfort and unease, particularly for me. It's also very suspenseful because there is a section halfway through this book that when I got there, my heart was racing, I was hanging on the edge of my seat, and it was at that point that I realized this book has me. Like, I am in its grip and I want to know what happens. Also, just in case you have any misconceptions about what this book is about the way that I did, I thought that this was about 4 Blackfeet men who were going to be teaming up together to stop this entity who is trying to kill them. No, absolutely not. And I should have known that that wasn't what this book was about when I started going through the quotes, you know, the praise for The Only Good Indians, and there's one at the front of the book that says, "I like stories where nobody escapes their past because it's what I fear most." The Only Good Indians is true horror. Like, I would argue that this is actually probably more horror than most of the Stephen King books that I've read, because this made me gag. There were parts where I actually had to close the book and I was like, oh my God. And I would tell Keaton about what I just read, and his immediate response to me was, what the fuck? He was disturbed by it and he didn't even read the book. Like, that's how, again, effective this was. But it really got me thinking, you know, is this violence for violence sake, or is there a moral? And I would argue that there absolutely is a moral here, but which one is it? One moral you could argue is that no bad deed goes unpunished even 10 years later. If you do something dishonorable, eventually it's going to come back to bite you in the butt. You could also say that it's about how terrible things happen to innocent people or creatures for no good reason, and how it is a waste to destroy innocence just because you can. I honestly think anybody who reads this book could get something a little bit different out of it, so if you were someone who read this, I would love to hear down in the comments what you thought the main moral of the story was. Some themes that were explored in here as well were guilt, tradition, identity, spirituality, but mainly guilt, because in here, guilt drives one of our characters insane. I really hate to admit this, but I was also probably one of the only people who didn't understand the title of this book. It sat on my shelf for a while and I would look at it every now and again, or I'd hear people talk about it on BookTube, and I was like, The Only Good Indians. What does that mean? Like, where does this title come from? Just in case you're like me and you don't know where that came from, there is a phrase that was started, I believe it was back during the Civil War, which was "The only good Indian is a dead Indian." So once it got to the part of the book where the phrase is actually said, because it is explained in here, the title hit very differently for me. So if you're somebody who already knew what this meant, you probably knew what you were getting into from the beginning. Again, my misconception about what this book was about also had to do with the fact that I didn't understand the title. I'm very disappointed at myself. In the beginning, I found the syntax a little confusing. Like, I would have to go back and reread sentences just to make sure I understood what was going on. that probably had more so to do with my brain than the way that the book was written, because it did eventually get better for me. Like by the end of the book, I totally understood everything that was going on and I felt fine. But there was something about it in the beginning that just wasn't meshing well with me. And I'm going to be talking about this more in the spoiler section, but I think that might have to do with the fact that there are just some things in this book that are not explained. Like, you have to go into this being comfortable with the fact that some of it is just not going to make logical sense. It's a fantastical story that's told almost like a myth, like a legend. So those elements are incorporated in where sometimes you read something and you're like, that doesn't really feel like going from point A to point B. It feels more like going from point A to point E, but we get there eventually. But to me, the characters felt very real, and I think Jones represented them in such a way that they didn't feel like just a collection of stereotypes, because he was writing from his own perspective. Again, this is an own voices book, and I think that that was very important. After I finished this book, I very quickly read an article in the Los Angeles Times. It was something I just happened upon, where a reviewer was talking about how Jones seemed to be reclaiming this idea of the Indian curse, but to them, they criticized that it was covered up by the gore and by the fact that we only have one character in here who spends any time trying to think about why any of this is happening or what caused it, which I do think is kind of a fair criticism, because the entity in this book spends time murdering innocent people and innocent animals for seemingly no reason, and that is also part of why I ended up needing to spend time thinking about what the moral of the story was. But I'm also very comfortable saying that I might have had difficulty with trying to parse out the moral simply because I'm white. Like, I don't have the background and the cultural context necessary maybe to appreciate this as much as somebody who is from this background. So I fully am willing to admit that. But that's also why I don't think that there's just one answer to what this book means, because depending on your background, you could come up with all sorts of things about what this story is about. One thing this book absolutely is, though, is a discussion piece. This would be great for any sort of horror book club, in my opinion, just based off of the plot and the emotional evocation of this story, and that's also the reason why I am giving it 4 stars. And this is the part of the video where I'm now going to be moving into the spoiler section, so if you were interested in reading this and you haven't already, kindly exit the video so that I don't ruin anything for you. But if you were planning on sticking around because you've already read this, I'm going to start discussing those things in 3, 2, 1. And we're in the spoiler section, so I can assume if you're still here that you've either already read The Only Good Indians or you just don't give a damn about spoilers, but either way, here we go. If you want to know the moment that grabbed my attention, it was when Lewis thought his wife Peta was the Elkhead woman, but what grabbed me by the throat was when he was convinced that Shani was the Elkhead woman, and he convinces her to come over, and he's trying to, secretly look at her through the fan blade, and she won't quite get under it, so he tricks her into going into the garage and scalps her with his motorcycle. That was the part where I actually had to close the book because I almost gagged. It was so visceral, and I could picture it in my mind's eye. It was very descriptive. That is why it grabbed my attention, because where could it possibly go from here? I really did go into this thinking that these guys were going to be teaming up together. So the book is split into 4 sections, right? And the first section is really short. That's where we get introduced to Richard. And Richard pretty quickly ends up getting killed off. And so we have 3 guys left. And I'm thinking, okay, then the 3 guys are going to be the ones who end up kind of defeating this entity, whatever it is. We get introduced to Lewis. We focus on Lewis up to the halfway point of the book. It's just him. And he's the one that's kind of trying to solve this mystery and figure out what's going on. And then he gets murdered. And then I'm thinking, okay, so then that means that since there's 4 sections and there's 4 men, that each one of the sections is going to focus on a different guy to pick off. And then that ended up not being right either, because the 3rd section was about Gabe and Cass collectively. But the beginning of that one started with the perspective of Gabe's daughter, Denora. And then I had the theory, I was like, okay, then that means that Gabe and Cass are going to die in the 3rd section of the book, and the last section is going to be the Elkhead woman going after Denora. And that ended up being the real one. So this book, I had no idea the way it was structured. It totally threw me for a loop. I liked that it kept me guessing. It was really unique in that way, and it honestly made the book more fun and more enjoyable to try to get through because it felt pretty fast-paced. I like the way that this story ends as if this entire novel is some giant legend or myth that is told around a campfire, that Denora You know, she was the last one left. She's being chased after by the elkhead woman, and she chooses to end the cycle of violence by sparing the elkhead woman and her baby from being shot at by her stepdad. And this is like the pivotal moment in her life where she, if you will, learns respect for an opponent because she plays basketball, and that's something that she carries with her into like her championships and things at the end of the book. And I really like that message. I thought that that was pretty deep and it was pretty moving. The question of, is this story real in the universe that this book takes place in, or is it just a tale that people tell? I thought that that was really cool. Because The Only Good Indians is framed as this folklore tale, you don't really have to suspend your belief because you know that the elements in it are going to be fantastical, right? We know that anything can happen in the world as long as it falls within the rules of that universe. We see that in high fantasy all the time, but this isn't fantasy. This is horror. And because of that, horror doesn't always explain the rules of the world. It doesn't always tell you what the boundary is of like what you can and can't do. And that is why you are going to leave not understanding everything, and you just have to be okay with that. So some examples of things in this book that didn't necessarily make sense. The first is, why did the elkhead woman end up turning into a person when she was born as an elk, and why did that person look like Shani? Why was 2 days a long enough time to gestate this entity enough that she could be birthed into the world from Peta's dead body? And how did Lewis bring her to life just by thinking about her? And the third thing is, how was the elk baby who was taken out of his mother's body 10 years ago and buried in the dirt still alive? Are we to interpret that it was alive this entire time? Or did he come back because his mom was nearby? It's folklore and it's horror. It doesn't have to make sense. In terms of my take on the individual characters, we don't get enough time to learn anything about Richard, right? Because we get like such a short period of time with him. So I don't know whether he was a reasonably moral or ethical person, or if he was just some guy like trying to escape the reservation and make a life for himself. I can't really comment on him. Lewis was far more complicated to me because my feeling about him went basically from one end of the spectrum to the other, because I started out thinking that he actually seemed like a reasonably good guy. He's just this bookish man who left the reservation to marry this woman that he loved, and he's out here trying to like scrape by with his life. What took a turn for me wasn't even the point where we get to the murder, it's with his dog Harley. So very early on, first 40 pages, he finds Harley hanging from the fence, asphyxiating to death. He thinks his dog is already dead, and it turns out that he's still alive. So what do? He and his wife end up taking Harley and they put him in the garage on top of this big pile of sleeping bags. Don't get him any vet service, any medical attention of any kind. They leave him in the garage and are essentially just condemning him to die. But then it got so much worse, right? Because then Harley gets stomped to death. He doesn't know who did it. He doesn't know if it's this entity he keeps seeing or if his wife killed their dog. He's really not sure. So his dog gets stomped to death into this bloody pulp in this mess of all these sleeping bags, and Lewis takes him, he wraps him up in one of the bags, and he goes and he buries him out in the backyard. That is a horribly traumatizing situation, and anybody who like really cared about their dog or loved their dog in any fashion would be beside themselves for I don't even know how long. If that happened to one of my animals, I don't know how I would ever cope with that after the fact. Like, it would take a really long time. Well, for Lewis, just 2 days later, he's walking Peta into the garage and they're having sex on top of the sleeping bags that his dog just got stomped to death on. What the fuck kind of a person is that? Like, I hated him. Hated Lewis at that moment. So when we get to the point where, you know, he's murdered Shani, he's scalped her with the motorcycle, he's covered in blood, he's prying all of her teeth out of her mouth, and then we go into the living room where Peta is, and she falls off the ladder, and she dies an accidental death, and he walks over and he starts prying all the teeth out of her mouth too, because he's looking for Ivory, because he's trying to figure out which one of them was the real elkhead woman. It was still surprising, it was still visceral, only because the descriptions were so detailed. But with his mentality, like the way that he just really didn't seem to care that much about anybody or anything, I was like, yeah, I guess it makes sense for this man's character. His section to me was probably the one that bothered me the most, because by then I now knew what I was getting into, right, with Gabe and with Cass. Speaking of Gabe, I didn't give a shit about his demise at all. Like, I didn't think that he was a good person. He proved himself to be an alcoholic, thieving asshole who was also a really terrible dad, and he didn't give a crap about anybody. And then he also sees one of Cass's dogs injured, and instead of going to Cass and telling him that anything's going on as he's standing around these bodies of these dogs and one of them's whining to death, instead of going to get help, he just picks up a big rock and just beats the dog's head in to silence her and goes back into the tent like nothing happened, and he's gonna pretend like he didn't know anything about it. So when Cass finds all of his dogs dead the next morning, it's like, well, I didn't do that. Hated him, didn't care about his death at all. I did feel really bad for Cass though. We don't explore his character all that much, but what I'm able to figure out from him is he's also trying to change his life. He's trying to settle down. He's found a woman that he loves. He has all of these animals that he cares for. He seemed like an okay guy. I don't think that he necessarily deserved the ending that he got. As a note about the dogs and all of the violence and the death that happens to them, I feel like I have to talk about this as like its own point just because there's so much of it. Of course I didn't like it. Of course I found it really upsetting, and I hated reading any of it. One thing that I will say about the way that Jones handled the deaths of the dogs is at least it wasn't cruelty for the sake of cruelty. The elk-head woman, you know, she has the spirit of an elk. Dogs are predators, wolves are predators, dogs are also man's best friend. So I think the mentality is just they pose a threat to her because they can sniff her out, they can tell what she actually is, you know, because dogs are supposed to be very intuitive, but also they could alert their owners to her overall plan and prevent her from murdering these men. So what does she do? Well, she decides to take the dogs out, and how does she do that? In the most brutal fashion possible. Again, I didn't like it, but at least there was something that made sense. It's not like reading books about serial killers where they just torture animals because they think it's fun. She didn't find it to be fun. She didn't enjoy the deaths of the dogs, I don't think. It was just something that she felt like she had to do in order to accomplish her goal. Overall, this was very compelling horror. I would definitely read something from Stephen Graham Jones again. Honestly, I really hope that whatever I read from him next doesn't have as much animal violence or really any animal violence at all. Those are my hopes. My fingers are crossed, but overall this was good. And like I said, I give this 4 stars. I think that this is worth a read. I don't think that I'm ever going to read this again. This isn't reread worthy for me, but it was worth one read. And with that, that is what I have for you today. So I really hope that you enjoyed this review. If you read The Only Good Indians, please comment down below what you thought of the book and what rating you gave it. Do you feel like my review is fair? I would love to hear it. If you stuck around because you just don't give a damn about spoilers, let me know if this is something that you plan to pick up, or if you've heard enough and you're like, you know what, I think I'm good. I don't need to read that book, because that would be totally okay too. Really appreciate you spending this time with me. So as always, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day or evening, that you all stay safe out there, and I'll see you next time.